Welcome back to our podcast and my quest for the truth, the whole truth, and no dogma. I was halfway through interviewing Patrick McKeown, the Buteyko man. You know, this is the man that's really done more than anyone else to bring Buteyko breathing, the science and the philosophy and the practice into the modern world. Patrick, where were we? We're going through your 31 points, your benefits. We were about halfway through. We were getting slightly sidetracked on asthma. That's a fascinating subject. I think it actually comes later in the numerical series. Where were we? I think if we bring up the slide, we were going about redistribution of blood throughout the lungs, if I remember correctly.
You covered that one.
Actually, no, we were into defense against inhaled
Yes,
pathogens, because this is
correct.
something that
Uh,
really fascinates me.
and we spoke about this quite a bit, and just even on the basis of, people are getting the different flu jabs and things like that, and a lot of it is going to be for airborne issues. Why not talk about the nose? So we have to bring it back to basics here, that our nose is the first point of defense of all of the air that's coming from the atmosphere into the body. And when it comes in through the nose, at least it gives our body some chance at being able to fight or deactivate viruses before they arrive to the lungs. But when we breathe through the mouth, and I suppose, Mike, I'm going to, if we look at the mouth itself, and you're obviously looking into mouths every day of the week, what's in the mouth? Our teeth, our tongue, our hard palate, our soft palate, the back of the throat, and that's pretty much it, our gums, etc. And none of those do anything for breathing. Our teeth don't do anything for breathing. So literally we can break down what does the mouth do by virtue of what's in the mouth. So whatever is in the mouth is for speaking, it's for eating, it's for drinking, it's for social bonding. So those are the main functions that the mouth does. And then we have to think about, well, what's inside the nose, and the turbinates and the design of the nose and the mucus blanket and the production of nitric oxide, the moisture, all the blood flow that goes through the nose to make sure that the air is warmed up before it comes into the lungs, all of the communication from the nose to the brain. So there's so much going on. So just even breaking it down, it's not natural to mouth breathe. If it was natural and normal to mouth breathe, well, there would be something in the mouth that serves a purpose in terms of breathing, but there's nothing there.
So, Patrick, do you think there is a place for mouth breathing during moments of extreme endurance or oxygen requirement?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So there's a difference between an individual who has been mouth breathing all their time during physical exercise, and most people, when they do physical exercise, even moderate physical exercise, they have their mouth open. One study back in 1983, they put a video camera on the 90-kilometer mark, and they analyzed about 1,000 people in a 10-kilometer fun run. And
Fascinating. Yes.
then the researchers looked back and they said, well, what was the instance of mouth breathing in a fun run? So there's nothing competitive about this, but over 96% of people passed that point with their mouth open, breathing in and out through the mouth. And
Well,
the
mouth
few
open, you don't
individuals,
know whether they were breathing through it.
yes, but I suppose,
Is it?
I
Is it
always
interesting?
know you're correct when you say that, but at the same time, Mike, like in somebody talking about nasal breathing, I think it's really, really important that our lips are together. Even though people
Yes,
might say to me,
I
well, they have their
totally
mouth open, but they may
understand.
not be
But I
breathing
just
through
remember
it.
the work of Linda Aronson and Woodside putting people
Yes,
into these, what they look like saunas. You know, the sauna that comes up to the neck here. So they put them in similar things, seal it around here, and then they could determine how much they were breathing nasally. Well, they could determine how much they were breathing, and then they would put sensors in the mouth and nose, and they put, trouble is, so many of the things they were doing, I question whether people would have been affected by the methodology. But it was a huge, did the nose go through the air? Did it go through the mouth? Some people had open mouth posture, but were breathing through the nose. But this was all done at rest. And of course, all the research I know is done at rest. So these people doing an activity, even just a fun run, is a completely different world. It's a different universe.
it is. And, then we have to think about, say, an individual who is doing physical exercise, actually trains physically with their mouth closed over a period of time. what happens is that their body adapts to nasal breathing. They have a higher tolerance of carbon dioxide, so they have a reduced sensation of breathlessness. They have better recruitment of their diaphragm. And as a result of the better function and strength of the diaphragm from the training with the mouth closed, they also have reduced sensation of breathlessness during exercise.
All of this mouth breathing is a hell of a lot more work. You get wearing yourself out simply from breathing. You want to make this the most efficient, the most calm, the most lean as you can. And then particularly if you're going to do competitive running.
And how do you then make yourself more efficient with your breathing? Well, the objective there is to do your physical exercise during training with less air. And therefore, you're training your body to do physical exercise with reduced ventilation. And George Dallam, as I spoke about in part 1 of our chat, he has done a number of studies because he has been, as a sports scientist, he has been interested in nasal breathing during physical exercise for almost 20 years. And unfortunately now he's due to retire. So we have all of this wealth of information. And one of his papers that was published in 2018, he got 10 recreational athletes. He had them breathe through their nose exclusively for 6 months. And at the end of 6 months, then he tested them with nasal breathing versus mouth breathing. With nose breathing, they had 22% less ventilation. So back to your point, they were able to perform.
Say that again. With nose breathing,
yes, they needed 22% less air.
Okay, so they required 22% less. So that's a major efficiency increase. If you want to be a professional
it's for sure.
runner, hey, listen in. This is really going to help you.
And on the basis that every breath we take, there's an energy expended by the respiratory system. And, even though our lungs and our entire respiratory system, of course, is the purpose of breathing, but it needs its own supply of oxygen. And as we sit here, about 2 to 3% of our oxygen is going to support the respiratory system. If we do moderate exercise, it might be 6%. If we do intense exercise, it may be 10%. And if we do maximum physical exercise, it could be 15%.
That's so 15% of the oxygen you required is just for the breathing system.
Correct. And if you then have somebody with dysfunctional breathing who are inefficient and uneconomical, that they are breathing too hard for a given intensity and duration of physical exercise.
One of the signs of being unfit is this huge wheezing and huge chest, expansion and contraction.
Yes.
You can see these guys are working an enormous amount just to breathe.
Yes. And if those individuals then improve their everyday breathing patterns, and when we're talking about breathing, of course, we're not just focusing on the biomechanical, that breathing is multidimensional. You have the biochemical, which is focusing on carbon dioxide. You have the biomechanical, which is the diaphragm, and then you have the psychophysiological. But when you switch from mouth to nose breathing during physical exercise, the benefits are absolutely enormous. Even just on the basis that when you breathe through your nose during any sort of physical exercise, I'm talking about walking, gardening, yoga, in and out through the nose, it will improve blood flow throughout your body, including the brain. And this came up as well with Dallam because I had written presentations on, I was interested in concussion. So post-concussion syndrome, there is a reduction of blood flow to the brain, and this can persist for many, many months and even years. But yet we know, based on simple physiology, that carbon dioxide is a vasodilator. It helps to improve blood flow. It helps to increase blood circulation. If you do your walk or your jog with your mouth closed, you will improve blood flow and oxygen delivery to the brain. And given that the human brain consumes 20% of oxygen.
Yeah, a massive amount. This is, I think, a really important point to get over to people. It's where the carbon dioxide's present, that will then open up the blood flow, help release the oxygen, because that's where it's needed. It's a really clever feedback mechanism. And don't just breathe more, breathe less. It's surprisingly effective.
And I remember it and also with many of our students over the years, they would often have cold hands and cold feet and brain fog. And nobody, it's very seldom that somebody would put that connection with their breathing. But I can remember the day that I started actually breathing less air. So I was simply sitting down. I was taking a minimal breath of air into my nose, a really soft breath in, taking in maybe about 70% of the normal volume that I would take in, and then a really relaxed and a slow, gentle breath out. And the objective was to breathe less air into my lungs to the point that I was feeling that I was not getting enough air. And of course, the sensation that I wasn't getting enough air is signifying that carbon dioxide is increased in the blood, because the driver to breathe is not oxygen. The primary driver to breathe is carbon dioxide. So as I was breathing less air and I was feeling air hunger, which was signifying that carbon dioxide was increasing in the lungs and therefore in the blood leaving the lungs, I started feeling the warmth coming into my fingers. I never realized that I could influence my entire blood circulation, which is consisting of 50,000 miles of blood vessels throughout the human body. And it wasn't about taking the full big breaths. And I can only think of the number of people who have a belief that if they want to improve their blood circulation and oxygen delivery, they intentionally take full big breaths. Little do they know that they are doing the wrong thing. They should be doing the opposite.
Yeah.
Yes.
Nice. Anyway, Patrick, let's continue down your list, or we're never going to get anywhere here.
This is the conversation. This is the rabbit hole that we're going down, Mike. So,
before you move on to 13, have we got anywhere about the immune system?
well, in terms of it's been very understudied looking at Buteyko and the immune system. If we just move aside from Buteyko and look at the functions of the nose, any medical textbook that includes a section on respiratory physiology will talk about the mucus blanket there, and there's various cells there that are helping to inactivate or deactivate foreign invaders coming into the body and recognize. And we have nitric oxide there as well. So, just the normal physiology of the nose is pointing to that. Now, there was one paper on the Buteyko method, and they did look at IgE levels. So IgE is a marker of inflammation.
Yep.
And they found that those individuals, by practicing the Buteyko method, that they were able to reduce IgE levels. So that would point then that there's a reduced inflammatory response as a result of practicing the Buteyko method. Of course, it needs further studies. But I'm also going to think of this one here. In 1998, there was a neuroscientist in New York called Kevin Tracy. And Kevin Tracy had a hypothesis that if he stimulated the vagus nerve, he could block pro-inflammatory cytokines, so the chemical messengers that trigger inflammation. And he talked about this, and of course, his colleagues were out apparently in the corridor, and they were placing bets that he could not prove it. So in the rat, he stimulated the vagus nerve, and he showed that it could reduce pro-inflammatory cytokines. Now we have to ask, by breathing in and out through the nose, resulting in a lighter breath, a slower breath, an increased recruitment of the diaphragm, and all of those things will contribute to stimulating the vagus nerve. And of course, the vagus nerve is this nerve that's wandering throughout the human body. And the word vagus is coming from wanderer nerve.
That's why we get the term vagrant, yes. Because it's the wanderer.
Correct. Or vagabond.
Vagabond, yes.
And, so there is that connection there, but yet there's no study that I'm aware of that's investigating nasal breathing and the influence on the vagus nerve. But I have seen anecdotally hundreds of people with their mouth closed during sleep. Their heart rate variability is improving as a result of it. And people who are practicing breathing exercises and optimizing their HRV, and of course, heart rate variability is an objective, it's an objective feedback of your vagal tone. How well is your vagus nerve functioning?
Yes.
We don't want to be in that increased stress response. We want to have balance.
I do want to point out that the popularity of heart rate variability is because it's easier to measure. So it's easier to measure with the devices that we currently have, the Aura type rings, the Whoop type wristwatches. A pulse oximeter effectively can measure heart rate variability. So because of that, it's suddenly become this, and it does hold a lot of data, it holds a lot of information, but of course it's something that we can control. So many of these other things, as we've been discussing, are hard to measure.
Yes. Now, and the devices are only giving you feedback. Then we have to ask the question, well, how do we help optimize it? And this, of course, is where Buteyko can help, and other breathing exercises, anything that will help to bring balance, dampen the stress response, and increase the relaxation response. But the other thing, Mike, is the one thing that sets Buteyko apart from, because not all breathing exercises are the same, the emphasis with Buteyko is hypoventilation. It's about breathing less. And really that is very, very important to mention, because it addresses the habit of chronic overbreathing, which is the most common form of breathing pattern disorder that's in the population. And even if we were to look at, well, what's the incidence? A Cochrane review concluded it was 9.5% of the general population.
Sorry,
Other
9.5
papers
what?
of the general, so just of the normal population. Now,
Doing what?
we're doing dysfunctional breathing. So they had breathing pattern disorders. Now, but the question is, how do you assess dysfunctional breathing? This is a little bit like our question in part one. How would you know if somebody's breathing in and out through the nose versus the mouth? Like, what are the researchers looking at? To assess dysfunctional breathing, you do have to look at breathing from a number of different dimensions. You have to monitor carbon dioxide to get an indication of the chemosensitivity to carbon dioxide. In other words, how is the body reacting to the accumulation of carbon dioxide? You have to monitor, is the person breathing high in the upper chest, or are they breathing low with good recruitment of the diaphragm? And then also to look at the psychophysiological connection with breathing, the mind-body connection. So that could be using the Nijmegen questionnaire or the self-evaluation of breathing questionnaire. But the big thing here is that I would like to point out 75% of the anxiety population are reported to have dysfunctional breathing. And if we think about that, whenever we as human beings, it does, because of that feedback loop there.
And just looking at them, looking at people with anxiety, you can see how they're breathing badly. But sorry, I interjected. Do continue.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. So, if we do experience chronic stress as human beings, of course our breathing is impacted, and we react to that difficult situation by going into the fight or flight response. We breathe faster, we breathe harder, we breathe upper chest, we sigh more, or we can stop breathing. We often have the mouth open. And if we're under chronic stress, well then of course we develop a habit of breathing that way. And if we develop a habit of breathing that way, now our breathing pattern is feeding into the stress response because the brain is interpreting that there is a threat to the body and the brain is putting us into a fight or flight response. But the other aspect is that our sleep is impacted. We can never kind of isolate breathing just on its own as one function. We have to look at the impact of breathing and the mind and sleep. And oftentimes it's all three that are impacted there. But even with athletes, there was a Japanese study of 1,933 athletes published in 2020 or 2022. It's published in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research. They concluded that 90% of athletes, regardless of age, and this is ranging from recreational right up to professional, 90% of them had dysfunctional breathing from a biomechanical point of view. They were breathing too high in the upper chest, reduced recruitment of the diaphragm. So sometimes we expect athletes to have good breathing, and that's not necessarily the case. And the reason being is because breathing, how many athletes have a breathing coach? Now it's starting to happen.
Well, yes, but, you're a good part of this.
But it's relatively recent.
So if we can, I was going to point out, before we move on to defense against pathogens, it's just that what strikes me, and I've read a couple of papers that support this, but a nascent idea in my head, it's that when you breathe through your nose, you use the system properly. Antigens are identified by the correct system. They get put on a list. They're identified. I think that would, if I'm correct, would be IgA. I can't remember really my early learnings as I studied.
Yeah, of course.
Then if something arrives straight through your lungs, it suddenly appears basically in your blood, because we've said there's this paper thin barrier between the incoming air and then the inside of the body effectively. The pathogens or the antigens can pass through that. They then simply appear in the body, and the body doesn't like that type of thing. So then it will set up, I think, an IgG response. And I'm thinking we've suddenly seen this massive increase in allergies. Could this be related to the massive increase in mouth breathing we're seeing, and the massive increase in malocclusion and all of these other problems with the head that, this quest I'm on to find answers to these problems of the head? And breathing through the mouth, could that be presenting antigens in the wrong way, making you hypersensitive to these things? And that then would include anything in the kitchen that you people in the kitchen in the downstairs of the house predominantly most of the time when they're at home. Lack of ventilation, you've got these very small particles. I remember one thing that really knocked me home about how minute the amount of particles required to set off an immune response was that anecdotal learning from beekeepers. The beekeepers that kept their uniform in the house had kids that would get anaphylactic shocks to bee stings, whereas beekeepers that kept their uniform, their outfit, their work outfit in the garden shed or their toolbox shed, whatever they used, their kids weren't getting hypersensitivities. So this is a minute amount. Occasionally a beekeeper would be stung by a bee, a fraction of poisons left there, and a little bit that associates into the air, but that constant amount was enough, apparently, to cause hypersensitivity reactions in their children. So we need very small amounts. And is it because all of these things like peanuts and dander and dust and all of these things, they're in the house, some not in minute amounts, and you're breathing through the mouth, and that's setting off the allergic response?
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting. It kind of, as you were talking there, I remember the study, with the Berlin Wall, which of course we had divided Berlin into east and west.
A beautiful
And
split
with
experiment.
it's what an amazing, we as human beings, we can sometimes mess it up big time. But when the wall came down in 1989, of course, people from East Germany started moving to the West and adopting the Western lifestyles, and their instance of allergies increased dramatically. Now, we have to think about what was East Germany like. Well, it was pretty high pollution. It was huge industrialization, and yet these individuals were much less prone to allergies and asthma and rhinitis that in the West. And genetically, they were the same people. So I just found it fascinating, and I'm not sure if we can ever get to the answer of it, Mike, but certainly the environment is playing a huge role. And I think you made a couple of points there. The reduced ventilation inside in houses, and houses now are becoming increasingly airtight because with achieving passive standards, even though there's a ventilation system, but how many people will actually clean it or make sure that the filters are cleaned on an annual basis? We're very sedentary. Our foods are different. There's so many different points, but it's still coming back to what can we do? We can nasal breathe. Yeah, especially with anything in terms of the respiratory system itself, helping to reduce the incidence of colds and chest infections.
Yeah, another tip you remind me of, always have a window open when you're asleep and the heating off.
Yes, it's very, very important.
Clearly that must be regionally specific, but in the regions we're in, heating off, window open whenever you can.
Yes. And even if it's just a fraction, it's just to allow that circulation of air to happen, because I knew as a kid growing up with asthma, anytime the window was closed, I always woke up with more asthma. And wherever the window was open, even though I was a chronic mouth breather. So and I remember my father used to come into the bedroom and he used to be giving out about it was so cold. The bedroom would be freezing, but yet it was a trade-off. I would still have the window open on the basis that it was easier for me to breathe. And at that age, I might have been at 10 or 11 or 12 years of age. So as a young child. So there's definitely something in it. Now, window open, enough to allow a circulation of air, but making sure that we're breathing in and out through the nose so that the cold, dry air is not going to aggravate the airways.
Okay, now, Pat, we must go on to our list here. We're getting diverted.
So our next one then is, correct, helping to maintain the elasticity of the lungs. If we think about the human lungs, Mike, and during rest, we're taking about 12, 14 breaths per minute. During physical exercise, especially if it's intense, it can be 50 breaths per minute. So we need such an elasticity of the lungs that the lungs itself are able to expand and contract. And of course, when we think about air coming into the body, the brain is constantly, so we have a part of the brain in the brain stem, which is a stalk-like structure that connects the brain to the spinal cord. So it's a very primitive part of the brain, and housed in that is the respiratory center. And in the medulla is monitoring mainly carbon dioxide and blood pH. So when carbon dioxide increases just a little and blood pH falls by just a little, the brain sends a signal via the phrenic nerve to the diaphragm breathing muscle. The diaphragm breathing muscle moves downwards during rest by about 1 to 2 centimeters, or during physical exercise it could be 10 to 15 centimeters. The intercostal muscles are the meat between our ribs pretty much. They pull out. So when we need to take in a breath, every breath that we take, it's following an instruction from the brain to the diaphragm. The diaphragm is moving downwards. Intercostal muscles are moving outwards. This increases the volume of the thorax, which in turn reduces the pressure inside the chest, and this causes the air to come into the lungs. Okay. So during the inspiration, of course, the lungs are filling up, even though at tidal volume. But maybe during intense physical exercise, we're breathing in 3 liters. During rest, we're breathing in about a half a liter. So we need this elasticity. And if we don't have this elasticity, it could be, for example, due to different genetic conditions or being exposed to environmental toxins, we can have fibrosing. And fibrosing would be scarring of the lung tissue. So we know that if we've got a scar in our hand, that part of the hand that's the scar has reduced elasticity. And this can be very problematic because then it's going to impede airflow and that individual then is going to have a breathing problem. When we breathe in and out through the nose, and this is Maurice Cottle, this is one of his points, because of the condition of air that's coming from the nose into the lungs, it helps to maintain elasticity of the lungs, a very important function as well.
So what we're saying here is that if you have if you have patches of the lungs that don't get good air perforation, those patches of the lungs will become more fibrosed over time.
Yes, it depends on really what they're exposed to. So if we think of the condition, cystic fibrosis is a genetic issue and like a terrible condition, and these individuals really can have difficulty breathing. And in addition to that, then their production of nitric oxide is quite low, so they can be more susceptible to chest problems, chest infections, pooling of mucus, etc. But then we may have another condition, pulmonary fibrosing. And pulmonary fibrosing may be somebody who is working in construction. And during their years of working in construction, they were taking in a lot of particles into their lungs, and it could have been anything ranging from asbestos to dust, cement, anything that's literally that on a building site. And their lungs then become fibrosing as a result of it. And it's almost then that their lungs are becoming rigid, and it's very difficult then. It reduces gas exchange. And the problem with pulmonary fibrosis, it can get worse over time. It's progressive. So with normal everyday individuals, though, coming back to nose breathing, it just helps the lungs to move that little bit freer.
So I'm trying to get to the bottom of it. So you're saying the more the lungs move, the more they keep their elasticity.
See, this is where Cottle, when I looked at Cottle's point, he made the point, but he didn't necessarily. I have to think of it possibly this way. If we take cold, dry, unfiltered air into the lungs, it's going to cause, and it can contribute to drying out of the airway walls, and it could contribute to bronchoconstriction. Now, over time, if those airways are continuously bronchoconstricting, in other words, narrowing of the airways over time, what can happen then is every episode that happens to that individual's lungs, that could then contribute to fibrosing. So it could be mouth breathing by virtue of the particle that's coming into the body, and also mouth breathing because it's unconditioned air coming in, which is causing the airways to narrow. And it's the recurrent episodes of airway narrowing that can lead to remodeling of the airways. And as a result, then, that there's a more permanent damage to the airways, including scarring of the lung tissue. So I have to think it could be that connection.
Great. So let's move on. We're going down now to point 15, warming of the incoming air, and then 16, probably we could take this together. Warming and humidification of the incoming air. That was in my textbooks when I was studying dentistry in my undergraduate. That is obvious and well known, Patrick. Do you want to cover that?
Yes, it is. And even the nose on the human being, it evolved in response to this. So if you see people say of African origin, and they often have quite short noses, and they've got quite big nostrils. So they were living in quite a hot environment, and their noses evolved to be able to condition that hot air. And of course, if you're living in a hot environment, you don't want to warm the incoming air, but you're likely cooling down the incoming air. And also then on the breath out, of course, the nose then is capturing the moisture and the heat from the exhale breath. So there's stories of individuals, well, more so, I was reading a book by Bill O'Reilly, and it was about the North American Indian tribe. And one of the tests that they were doing was that they would get the youngsters, and I'm not sure what age, maybe 15 years of age, teenagers, and part of the initiation process was for them to take a mouthful of water and to be able to run a long distance with that mouthful of water and to reach their destination and to spit out the mouthful of water. And one might be thinking firsthand, like, that's kind of a strange thing for them to do. But we have to bear in mind that if they're living in a very dry environment, if they are out running and they're hunting for periods of time, if they have their mouth open, they're going to be at risk of dehydration. So the whole purpose of becoming a warrior was to make sure that you were using your nose to conserve moisture. And it's very simple. If somebody has a mobile phone, and I don't have mine close to hand, if you just put the glass screen underneath your nose, and if you breathe onto it with your nose, you will see the halo left on the screen from the air coming from your nose. And then if you do the same and put the glass just in front of your mouth and do the same breath, you're breathing onto the screen with your mouth, you will literally see that the entire screen will be covered with moisture. So the nose,
more moisture coming out
huge,
the mouth and the nose.
42% more. So individuals then who are breathing in and out through their mouth may be more likely to be dehydrated. At the very least, they've chapped lips, because I don't see chapped lips in nasal breathers. They can have dry mouths. This increases plaque index. This can have an adverse effect on dental health. This could contribute to halitosis and bad breath. It could possibly contribute to dental cavities. Because
anecdotally discuss this stuff. I don't know how well it's been researched, but it is anecdotally discussed.
There are some papers on it showing that the plaque index is higher with mouth breathers versus nose breathers, and they also showed that the constitution of the microbiome in the mouth was different with mouth breathing than nasal breathing.
Yeah, that would make sense. How
there's another thing
diagnosing people to being mouth breathing or nose breathing, again, we can go back to Woodside and Linda and stuff. By the way, just chipping in, you described the spirit runners earlier on. I can't remember which nation. I did do that, learn that from my the app. We mentioned it in the app, the Mewing app, and apparently they would do some incredible tasks of arduous ability with a mouthful of water. They would come back, spit it out in front of the chief and their mother for some reason. Again, I see this maternal validation here, and these guys were incredible endurance athletes, incredible what they could achieve. And this goes back to this whole thing, is trying to do exercise and only nasally breathe. Trying to increase your oxygen need while still nasally breathing. I think for people with young children, that's a really, really good thing to try to do as a sort of a training, as an exercise, a good exercise to really help them nasally breathe. Because if you can nasally breathe under high endurance, then you're very good at nasal breathing.
For sure. And, it comes to a couple of points there. So your ability then to do physical exercise with your mouth closed is influenced by the degree of air hunger that you experience during physical exercise. And I should even just expand on it a small bit, because it kind of adds then a little bit to the question that was presented earlier on. Why do we switch to mouth breathing? We switch to mouth breathing when we feel we are not getting enough air coming in and out through our nose. So whether it's during rest or whether it's during physical exercise. At what point do we switch to mouth breathing during exercise? The research seems to show it's at 35 litres of air, give or take 5 litres. Now, the person's ability then to maintain nasal breathing during physical exercise will be influenced by nose size. And very often we see the black sprinters, that people of African origin, and they were able to do a 400-meter sprint with their mouth closed, which is amazing. Yeah. And I've looked at Sonia Ross.
Patrick, if you look at the skulls of our ancestors looked far more like them than they do look like us. I don't think there's much racial difference. I mean, it's the environment has maximised these changes, or the differences.
Yes, well, there's some small difference in our nose, because the Caucasian nose is longer and it is narrower, but I would absolutely agree with you.
Yes, yeah, there are some differences, but I do think so much of this is a difference between modern humans than it was between ancient humans.
When you talk about modern humans, are you talking about human skulls that were originated 10,000 years ago or 20,000 years ago? Well, at what point is it when we started farming?
Yeah, we're going to be practical here. We have only got a few skulls from this long ago, and even those we don't. I mean, the oldest complete skull was the Goth cave. What's that? Was 10,000 years ago or 8,000 years ago, and until recently you could have had the entire Paleolithic material in one shoebox. Clearly, it's in fact China has helped really push that marker back or increase the amount of material, but we're collecting more stuff. We then kind of have to infer a lot of this as well from the little bits of skulls we find, but it looks like 10, 20, let's say 10,000 years ago, ended the Paleolithic period. We had craniofacial structures much more similar, well, to everyone all around the world. We were more similar than we are now. And of course, what I'm observing is how the face tends to downswing. Now that's going to lengthen noses. So how much of that increased length of noses is a modern thing and just part of an environmental change, a secular change, rather than being an inherent genetic difference in people from ideal conditions who are fulfilling their full genetic potential? I don't know, and that's the quest I'm on.
And the thing, Mike, again, is like our ability to do physical exercise with the mouth closed, deviated septum, and I have one of them. I didn't realize that there was such a strong connection between a high upper palate and a deviated septum. And of course, if the roof of the mouth is high and you've got the roof of the mouth which is moving into the space of the nose, of course it's going to have some impact on the nose, and it's going to cause alterations because the roof of the mouth is the floor of the nose. So if the mouth is infringing on the nasal airway, it can contribute to the deviated septum, which again is so common.
We're not certain if the roof of the palate is going up or it's coming down. If everything's coming down, because you're looking at the research of Harvold, it looks like the floor of the nose, roof of the mouth, the top of the palate, the top apex of the palate, actually is coming down. I don't know that clearly. Again, we just need more information, we need more discussion, we need more facts, we need more analysis. But what I'm suggesting is that, the faces were growing like this. They're dropping down and back like that. If we've got a bit of paper. No bit of paper. You had a bit of paper, and of course, as soon as you bend the paper, it's going to flex. You'll shorten it. It's going to flex. Now,
yes,
you're talking about the vertical dimension. I'm talking about the sagittal direction. It could be either, and that's why I love conversations like this, because we're coming from different angles. And it's whenever you have a disagreement between professionals from different angles, you can open this up, and often there's so many gems within that disagreement.
Yeah, and again, we were talking as well, and I think we were talking about 10,000 years ago, but it's coming back to your point. This is much, much closer to home. If we think of the work of Dr. Weston Price, who was a dentist who had traveled the world, going from different country to country, looking at civilizations who had lived according to how they have lived for 10, 20, 30, 40,000 years. And I remember one group of people he went to were Gaelic people living off the Hebrides Islands. And he talked about first generation children becoming mouth breathers, and previous generations were not. And we're only talking about, 1920s here, 1937, I think his book was published. So this has happened in 3 generations. It's really happening quickly now. So it does come back to, is it the mouth open that's causing the change to the shape of the face, or is it the mouth open and the drop to tongue resting posture? So maybe we should be talking about both.
Yeah, we should be. Nothing does not deserve attention. In fact, it was fascinating because, Weston Price looked at the second epidemiological revolution. The first epidemiological revolution was going from hunter-gatherer to subsistence farming, and that progressed for quite a long period of time, depending where you are on the world. And then Weston Price observed the second epidemiological revolution, where we went from subsistence farming to being specialists. So I now don't grow my own food. I do a job, and that job earns me money. I then buy food, and now I'm very much a discerning purchaser. So when you spend your money, it's be specific about what you're going to buy. So we've had this real change in food to sell to people like me, to consumers, and this has changed everything. Now, Patrick, I'm going to have to call time again. We've finished our first 16 points. So we're going to come back. This is great, because this is the type of conversations I want to precipitate. We've just started this venture on this channel. We've been running this channel for many years. We've had lots of different angles and tacks. You just go look through the history of this channel. You can see what different directions we've come in. And we now want to be more scientific. I want to find answers. I want to get people like you on board. We're going to come back. So we've done, this is a second. So if anyone watching this now, there's a previous episode where we're talking about the same thing. And then when we come back, and I have a feeling looking at all of this, it's going to be another 2. So let's rock on. Let's get this done, because there's lots of information. I'm on this hunt. I want answers. I'm learning. And of course, then other people around me can learn, because this is what people want to do. All right.
Great stuff. Pleasure as always, Mike.
Listen, pleasure.